Hello, as most of our regular listeners know by now, we are still sad to see Kate Waldock, my co-host, leave CapitalIsn't to go to law school. However, we fully intend on continuing this podcast and we're really excited about what we're cooking up for the future. Although Kate is irreplaceable, we have selected a new co-host. She'll remain a secret for now, but we are incredibly excited to relaunch the podcast with her in September. In the meantime, we'll be airing archival episodes and unreleased content all through August. Content like this episode. On our last episode, we used clips of an interview with Lisa Cook, a professor from Michigan State University and the director of AES-ASP, the American Economic Association Summer Program. I had a much longer conversation with Professor Cook about the lack of diversity in the economic fields that we were able to fit into the last episode. But we think that conversation deserves to be aired. As we take a break to develop our show for September, we can't think of a better piece of unaired content to share with you. So we hope you enjoy listening, and we look forward to sharing the relaunched CapitalIsn't with you in September. We are very happy and honored to be joined here by Lisa Cook, who is a professor of economics at Michigan State. I would like to start with actually a difficult question that a lot of people don't ask, but many economists, and I would say even many of my colleagues do ask, and say, why diversity is important?
Because lived experiences are important and economics should be relevant. Economics should be relevant for our lives. It should be relevant for tackling the biggest problems that we have. And lived experiences inform this. And I would echo the words of Janet Yellen when she said that it was the lack of lived experience that led to the groupthink that led to the financial crisis. So if everybody is trained the same way, asks the same questions, has the same lived experience, you don't get any diversity of thinking about how the economy works or how it can work. Imagine how it can work, how the solutions might be fashioned. So that's why I would say diversity is important.
So I know this is a difficult question, but what did economics miss by not having enough Black economists or Hispanic economists, minorities in general?
Well, I'll speak from my own experience. My paper was macro. So what do you do when you have some constraint with respect to innovation? And I was thinking about long-term economic growth. And people were thinking, I guess, that if it had to do with African Americans, there's no way it's generalizable. But I think African Americans know that this experience was generalizable. How did I know that? Because at my seminars, people from Russia, people from China, places where the rule of law was precarious, was not enforced, they came up to me and they told me how intuitive it was, that this was their lived experience. So it took a decade for me to get that paper published. We could have learned a decade earlier had we not been thinking so narrowly.
That's very interesting, but can I push you a little bit farther? Because my impression is we even miss more than what you just described. I'm not disputing what we miss, but I think that we miss even more, which is a different understanding, a different approach to racial issues. I feel that there is a bit of a narrow view of the problem because at the end of the day, we think that either this is statistical discrimination and in some sense has some legitimacy because it's math and so it must be right, or is taste-based and we economists don't say much about taste. And so if you pull up a bunch of economists and say, what are your proposals to fix the consequence of racial inequalities, etc., I'm not so sure that there are so many brilliant ideas coming out. I think we have missed some serious research on that area. Am I unfair with the field?
Well, I'd say two things. First, I would say that with the example I gave, I'm just suggesting that we are missing out on the free flow of ideas. And I don't care what we're weighing in on, whether it's race or anything else, we're missing out on the free flow of ideas. This is why I'm so passionate about addressing sexual harassment and racial harassment in the profession, because we're missing out on the free flow of ideas by limiting people's engagement in these questions. So whether it's race or whether it's macro, I think, the way that I put this together is probably unusual. I was told it was unusual. But when I told Milton Friedman gave him the paper and he was talking about it, he's the one who was saying it was unusual in a good way. And the same with George Akerlof, the same with Paul Romer, same with Ken Arrow. But my colleagues, who were the ones who were editors and referees at the time, were thinking differently about it. And I'm not sure why that is. Now, so you're saying that this distinction between statistical and taste-based discrimination is something that most economists would agree on. I would say yes, but I would say that most economists of a certain vintage would agree on. I would say that most of my students would not agree with you. I would say that most African Americans reject this out of hand, because this gives an excuse for discrimination to exist and for it to be a legitimate exercise. Economics spends its time trying to prove whether discrimination exists. Other social sciences try to weigh in on how to fix it, because we've proven many times that it exists. But we have nothing to say about, or little to say, about how to fix this systemic issue. And I think that's where this distinction allows this to continue, when some of the most urgent issues of the day have to do with addressing this systemic problem. We shouldn't be talking about the low level of patenting by African Americans 100 years after its peak. So I'm saying that there's something systemic here, and many people reject the distinction between statistical discrimination and taste-based discrimination is legitimate.
No, I agree, but the point I was trying to make is that the fact that this is not necessarily mainstream might be due, I don't know whether this is a cause or effect, it's hard to separate the two, but it is certainly correlated with the very low penetration of Black scholars in economics.
I would say so. I think they're intertwined. If you don't think that you're discriminating against anybody, and you always are, this is self-reinforcing, right? Oh, I don't see any Black people here. Let's say at NBER, I don't see any Black people here at NBER. They must not deserve to be here. That's statistical discrimination. That's fine. Or it's taste-based. That's fine. We have nothing to say about preferences, right? So I think that this can be a self-reinforcing philosophy framework. In a sense, it's circular, and it's hard to be broken unless somebody shines a light on it. And unless we accept that there is no difference between the two. And they're both not legitimate, and both would stop the free flow of ideas.
So let's go to the essence of the issue. Why do you think there is so much underrepresentation of Black economists?
There is a deeply embedded thought in economics that African Americans, in a sense, don't belong, or that there's a narrow range of economic issues that African Americans can weigh in on. And I think this discussion came up. You probably know that we changed the name of the Eli Lecture to the AEA Distinguished Lecture. Why did we do that? There are some people who represent ideas that are just so offensive that they would be an impediment to people engaging in economics. And this is one of them. This is the father of the AEA, right? He was a eugenicist, a racist, misogynist. And that's not welcoming to people in the profession. Why would we have a lecture named for him when there are many other economists who've done great work and don't have those attributes? So that's why we renamed it the AA Distinguished Lecture. But I'm just saying that if we accepted these cues, these beliefs acritically, then we're going to wind up with myths that are perpetuated throughout economics. Again, this Gordian knot of, well, we don't see that many Black people. They must not be qualified to be here. They don't like math. They're always behind in math. They can't keep up in math. I hear this all the time. And this whole sort of deficit thinking, what African Americans have missed or why they're not prepared. And one of the things I found with the AEA summer program is that with the right exposure, these students can be as competitive as anybody else.
But I have to say, maybe I see my profession, our profession, with rose-pink glasses. No, pink. What is the expression?
Rose-colored glasses.
Rose-colored glasses. Okay, so maybe I see the profession with rose-colored glasses, but I understand that the foundation was not great. Unfortunately, in America and throughout the world, there's a lot of bad history. You go to management. I recently discovered that Taylor, who invented scientific management, took actual inspiration from the plantation and the way sort of slaves were treated. So if you think about sort of management, the entire management literature as those foundations, and you can go on and on in a lot of fields. This said, I don't think that most of my colleagues, and I don't only say Chicago, I say colleagues I interacted with, I wouldn't say that most of my colleagues are eugenist or believe in inferiority of any particular group of people. The way they think of themselves, and I say also I think of myself, is, we're trying to be objective on some metric of merit, and the candidates don't show up. So if you look at the applications, never, and I was for a while the person in charge of doing finance application at Booth. So I know the candidates that come up, and I can reassure that nobody consciously, now we can say unconsciously, but nobody consciously saw a Black candidate or an Hispanic candidate and put it down the list in any possible form or shape. In fact, if anything, there is an attempt to do the opposite. And I'm not saying that the profession is perfect. I'm just saying, how can you explain what's wrong? Because the most brutal way, the Eli way, if you want, is not present today, at least to my understanding. And maybe I'm naive. I'm happy to be proven wrong.
Well, I think there's several fundamental issues. If you're always using the same metrics, I mean, everybody would like to be quote unquote objective. It is extremely hard to be objective because we are trained in a certain way. I think the notion that Black people are defective in some way is pervasive in economics. I mean, and I think about my colleagues too. I don't think they mean to do it, but why don't we have more, you and I have more Black colleagues? It's not because they aren't doing anything. There are lots of, there are lots of Rhodes and Marshall scholars at Oxford with me, right? We have lots of high achieving Black people. Why haven't we had them come into the economics profession? In fact, I'm the only one. I met several people who were studying, several African Americans who were studying economics at Oxford when I was there. And I was the one who was not. I started Spelman as a physics and philosophy major, and I was reading PPE at Oxford, and they were the ones to exit. The most highly talented people in the world, and they decided this field was not for them. So what I'm saying is, I think that collectively we do this. Maybe we don't do it as individuals. Maybe it's not intentional. But where do these outcomes come from? Why don't we have Black colleagues? Where does this come from? Especially if we think talent is distributed uniformly across populations. So when I was interviewing people for admissions at Harvard when I was at the Kennedy School, I would ask some questions that my colleagues didn't even think of asking. Why did you not engage in this kind of activity? Why did, I was looking to see, If this is a typical profile of an MPP student, then why don't you have this on your resume? We sometimes think in a very elitist way, and I think that's the profession. If you didn't come from a middle-class family like I did, maybe you don't have the resources to participate in these extracurricular activities, right? So I think we have to we have to think about what we might be missing, and maybe sometimes that involves having other people in the room to ask what we might be missing. And I'm not saying that I'm perfect. I'm a product of this environment too. But I'm trying my best to change it, to learn about it and to change it.
I think you are saying three things that might all happening at the same time. In fact, I suspect they're all happening at the same time, but they might be of different importance, and particularly the fixes are very different. There is an issue of opportunities. If you come from a poor family, you are less likely to go to a good school, you're less likely to have private lessons, you're less likely to do this, you're less likely to do that. So, and in a sense, non-racial, because this is true for white and black, I think that there are two reasons in which the black people are particularly affected. One is, on average, they're poorer. Number two is, on average, also they end up being surrounded by other people who are poor, because what we learned from Brad Chetty is not only your family, but also is your neighborhood, and so on and so forth, and so this becomes particularly bad. But and this is one way to fix the problem, which in a sense is not, at least in the domain of you and I, when we make admission at our universities. And says this stuff exists, we might try to control it, but it needs to be fixed at a policy level, not at the school level.
Wait, just a second, Luigi, just so I understand, why wouldn't it be capable of being addressed at the school level?
We can make some handicap factors or some adjustment factors in our criteria, but if you got less training and you appear as one of our candidates less good because you have less training, this is not necessarily the fault of the school if you have less training. Some people say that we want to admit the best candidates. You're going to always admit, if you don't have some form of remedy or some form of compensation, you're always going to admit the same people or the people coming from the same places simply because they're better trained.
Right. But I would question that. So what do we know about the SAT? What is it? What is the variable that is most consistent with SAT scores? So all you're telling me is that your parents are wealthy, parents' income. So I'm saying that, are you getting the smartest kids, or are you getting, let's say for admissions for college, are you getting the smartest kids, or are you getting the wealthiest kids?
You're bringing the second point, which is super important, which is the definition of, if you want, merit, which is very subjective, okay? And I always tell the story that when I was admitting people at the PhD program at Booth, I was using certain criteria. Then somebody else came who was coming from the same university as me, was also Italian, and used different criteria. And the only difference is, actually, he had even a better GPA than mine at Bocconi, but I did well in the GRE. He did not do well in the GRE because he didn't study for it. He didn't think it was important. So he was putting very little weight on the GRE. I was putting a lot of weight on the GRE. And I think that we all tend to use the definition of merit, the stuff we do the best. So what are the A journal in a university? The one that the senior faculty have published in, right? Almost by definition. So in some places, you see some obscure journal that ends up in the A list. Why? Because the senior faculty have published in those journals, and all of a sudden, those journals become A list journals. So I think we're all kind of liable of that, and the definition of what is meritorious, what is valid, etc., is very subjective. And so this is where I think that doing a lot more of introspection on what the metrics are is very
I think that's absolutely critical. Economics is going to collapse on itself if it remains as incestuous as it is. If we keep nominating our friends for awards, for journal editorships, or referees, it's going to collapse on itself. That's why, I have a full inbox 3 or 4 times over, because my work was one of the few papers that would speak to the current moment, right? We're going to collapse on ourselves because we're just way too self-referential. My co-author, Trevon Logan, and I have talked often about our ideas originally being stolen by people. And most of our white colleagues did not have that problem early in their careers, having their ideas stolen just out in plain sight. And we stopped putting our working papers on a website until we had it as an MVR working paper, because we didn't feel protected. So I'm saying that there's a lot of there's a lot of privilege that is everywhere in every corner of our profession, from journals to social networks and so on. So yes, this self-referential way of the self-referential framework, I think, can't lead to the best ideas coming forward all the time.
But I thought, and maybe I'm wrong, that you were pointing also to a third factor, the intolerance of the profession or something like that, dissuade people from applying. The problem of metrics and preparation, etc., they're true in every field. They're true in medicine, they're true in biology, they're true in economics. But I gave a lecture to a bunch of students in medicine at Chicago, and it was a completely different universe from the one I'm used to lecture when I lecture economists.
In what way?
There were many more women, many more minorities, in a way that I don't see so much even among undergraduates at Chicago. So why there is this dissociation even within other fields? Why economics is particularly bad vis-a-vis law or vis-a-vis medicine or other fields?
Well, I think there are several things going on. So first of all, economics is worse than any other STEM field with respect to underrepresented minorities.
We're worse than math or physics?
Yes. So why is that? I think that there is some thought that is embedded in economics. Maybe it's that we use the race variable too much. And that leads to thinking that when you put in the race variable, there's something defective about people associated with being Black. And I think also we don't know anybody who's Black. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I walked into NBER meetings and people will ask me if I'm a sociologist just because I'm Black. So I'm just saying that I think that we have such a narrow view of what race does in our estimates. We believe all the work that variable is doing, and we're not admitting what's behind it. What's behind that variable? Behind that variable is systemic racism. So I'm just saying that I think we have let the science become religion and indoctrinated us to think about race in a certain way. And I don't think it's a healthy way. It's a way that keeps people from being invited in. We can keep asking, why is it that African Americans don't show up here? Well, you're taxing them. You're taxing them a lot to be here. And I'm hoping that we can figure out a way, now that we can acknowledge the tax, how do we diminish that tax? And I'm hoping that we're doing something in the AEA, now that I've been elected to the executive committee, and with all of the initiatives that are happening, I'm hoping that we're finding a way to minimize that tax.
And in part is sort of a chicken and egg problem, because there is so much underrepresentation that the strength within the group of minorities and women to change the thing is much weaker in economics than in other fields.
Right. No, that's right. And there's an open question about whether it should be their charge. It should be, if you're interested in the free flow of ideas, it seems like it should be everybody's interest to make sure that they feel welcome in the field.
Absolutely. And I think it should be of people like me, who are privileged white males, to help, if not lead the charge in this direction. I completely agree on that. Is very often when you look at the world from your vantage point, you don't even know that what happens.
I would agree. Can I tell you just one story?
Please.
So
Yeah.
I grew up in the Deep South, right? And, I was integrating every school that I went to originally. And I was beaten up a lot, right? Just because I happened to be Black. By the time I got to high school, so white schools were forming. They're called white flight schools, right? And the college professors, the university professors, sent their kids to public school. All of the weaker students went to private schools. So for my entire undergraduate life, I was completely skeptical of people who went to private schools, because it's like you've got to be either developmentally slow or racist to go to a school like that. So I'm saying that we all can live in a bubble until we're confronted with a different reality.
So I'm sorry that I took way more time than I promised that I would take, but is there something else you want to add that you have not said?
I should say that while this may seem like I am on the defensive, I'm not. I'm quite hopeful, because I think people learn, they confront, and they change. And I'm hoping that the economics profession will also be that way and change it for everybody. That's not just for the people who seemingly would be the beneficiaries. That's to the benefit of the entire profession and of us all.
Capital Isn't is a podcast from the University of Chicago Stiegler Center in collaboration with the Chicago Booth Review. Also check out promarket.org, a publication of the Stiegler Center. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review to Capital Isn't wherever you get your podcasts.